Thank you for the organizers and Engineer Pinto for having invited me to this extremely interesting committee. And this morning I was really very much impressed by the initial presentations that focused on the technological aspect, and quite rightly so, highlighting limitations and opportunities, whereas questions were more of a philosophical and social nature. In a way, I'll try to get in between, to get in this shift in the debate. To the technician, can you please turn on increase the volume? Can you hear me now? Yes. Now, I would like to tackle the social value of big data, and let me add open data, which is another buzzword mentioned this morning. I started to work as far as research in the sector of the social value of data when I read an article in The Economist in 2011 speaking about the results of the research of the Stockholm University on Uganda. It said that giving the communities the performance data about care in the hospitals and helping the communities to prepare claims, then the mortality rate of children under the age of 5 was reduced by 1/3. So the availability of this data had affected or had an influence on the life quality of people by reducing mortality rates. Then the data on school budgets were published, and this reduced the abuse of funds and improved the efficiency of schools. This kind of data are usually called open data. They are open data because they result from the collection of data by a public subject, hospitals, the Ministry for Health, which for free or at a marginal cost are offered to the society in the form of a public service. And this took place in Uganda and not in a so-called developed country. Another example I would like to make concerns the private sector. Recently, in Israel, a startup was set up called Brizometer, which is becoming successful, providing data on pollution in a given territory. The way in which this data, this weather or pollution data, the short-term pollution data are collected is based on the setting up on the collecting of different data. For example, we have Google Maps, which is open, and then it becomes proprietary and expensive. Then this is supplemented by the municipality sensors, the traffic data, the environmental data, and the satellite data. All these data are collected, gathered together, and molded together in this small app. And I would like to show you very briefly the app. Here you can see 4 different snapshots on data on pollution in Valencia. In red, you can see the intensity of the red color corresponds to an increased pollution. And this data, too, can be seen as data which can improve the quality of life. And from this point of view, are similar to the Uganda example, even though there are some differences in the Uganda case. Those are administrative and performance data. In this case, we have big data instead. As I've tried to show, the data are collected from different sources, and then a proprietary algorithm is applied, and it gives an output. The second aspect is that they are expensive data. Brizometer is a company on the market, and so it makes people pay for this data. In this way, we see what is the typical information flow in the case of a private data provider which acquires data from the social media, from the web, from the Internet of Things, and reuses open data coming from a public subject, adding value to this data and transforming them into market data or marketable data. The whole picture is given from this graph. Here you can see the two subjects, public subjects providing open data by their own nature, and then private subjects transforming this data into marketable data. Let's introduce some technology. Big data have already been described this morning. In the field of big data, we are interested in the public data and other data coming from a non-public sector, private sector. Amongst this, we pay attention to the available data. Alfonso Fugetta this morning said that there are some sources he cannot disclose because those are proprietary data of the application which has been built. Amongst the available data, we have accessible data without avoiding technicalities. Here we have accessible data which is available on a format which can be available, not PDF, for example. Amongst the accessible data, we are interested in the free data. The overlapping between these categories gives the open data. Together with the open data, we have the market data. Incidentally, I would like to show you a graph corresponding to an estimate made in 1977 on the evolution of services from 2,000 years ago up to 2050. As you can see, 75% of jobs is concentrated in services. By 2050, more than 60% of the services will concern services based on data. This is an answer to some of the considerations which were mentioned this morning. So is labor going to disappear? Are these jobs going to disappear? Well, no, but most of the jobs will be concentrated in the field of the so-called big data and open data. This is another graph taken from the Google Trends of the open data trend from 2012 onwards, because it's from 2012 that the open data topic became of some importance. So we have a recent phenomenon here, but the trend is a linear trend. It's not an exponential trend. It takes some time to transform the big data into open data, in other words. Now let's focus on the value issue. Value was mentioned yesterday and this morning too. I'm an engineer by training, and I tended to turn everything into figures and numbers. I have this fault as many other engineers. But let's consider what are the values, not concerning data, but concerning the e-government initiatives, rather. We have two kinds of values, the public value and the social value. Public value concerns the value that the citizens are looking for in the government initiatives in terms of vis-à-vis the strategic targets and on the basis of the experience they get about public services. So public value is concentrated on the achievement of objectives. You may have listened to the Travaglio Renzi broadcast yesterday evening. It was rather unpleasant. I tend to watch this kind of broadcast and then I repent. But they discussed whether the jobs increased or decreased. So checking facts is what citizens want. They want to check whether certain commitments have been met or not. Apart from the public value, we have a second kind of value, the social value. Social value of the initiatives is concentrated on the welfare state, on the ability to provide a reply to the need concerning the quality of life of people. We have had two different approaches, which are the more relevant together with others, two approaches in describing the social value of the E-initiatives. The first one was developed by OECD, and then another approach based on the so-called capabilities developed by the Nobel Award, Nobel Prize winner, Mr. Sen. The OECD Wellbeing Dimensions is really based on the dimensions of the governments. They are listed here, but please note here that in the case of Uganda, we observed the dimension of education and health. In the case of Brisometer, we observed the environment and health considered as dimension. Then we will consider another dimension, which is safety. Together with the dimensions, I'm an engineer, I'm also interested in measuring with figures the achievement of the results, and the OECD gives a certain number of objectives, some of which are listed here. The intensity of poverty, health-adjusted life expectancy, and so on and so forth. The SENS approach is based on two key aspects: human functioning and capabilities. Human functioning observes the state of the art, the present state of the life of people and the activities that people can carry out. So that observes the hic et nunc, the today of people. Capabilities observes the opportunities which are offered so as to improve the life situation, or to improve, enhance the opportunities, capabilities characterizing the life of people. At this point, we get to the concept of social value. I have to hurry up and speed up. So in our research, I will not have the possibility of describing it in all details, but at the end, I will give you my email address, and I can answer to your queries by email. But the social value of data of our definition, we may define the social value of an informative service according to the perception of the quality of services. So here, my daughter lives in the UK, and the police gives a list of the crimes, and the police provides open data which are provided to the neighborhood or to the single street. These open data are very important for my daughter who lives in England, because she can understand where to rent an apartment, and are also important for me, for my anxiety level about my daughter Chiara and where she lives. And they're also interesting for those renting out the apartments, but in a different way, because if, according to the open data provided by the police, an area is risky, then the apartment is rented for less money. This proves that when we have to observe these phenomena, then we can observe them according to a qualitative approach based on the user perception, or in a quantitative way based on the measurement of the phenomena. The qualitative approach is the case of Uganda, for example. The quantitative approach is that of Uganda. It's an objective. The qualitative approach is the example of the open data provided by the police and the price of the apartments. So, I have more time. I was mistaken, so I have more time at my disposal. So I would like to show you some more examples showing the perception of people in some cases, and in other cases the quantitative measurement based on the open data made available by the Hospital Consumer Assessment of Healthcare Providers and Systems in the USA. For example, you can know the textual address of a hospital is a very simple and trivial example. This is pure usage, because what can we do about that? But if we are in Manhattan and we have the georeferential address, if we feel sick or if someone we are with is feeling sick, then we have the possibility of giving the right address to the taxi driver, because we have a georeferential positioning giving the idea where the nearest hospital is. Then we have data concerning the cost of illnesses and pathologies, and of course this is a public data, and citizens must know how much is spent in public money for a specific illness or disease. It is also important for the institutions who can perform a public assessment on the efficiency and the standard costs. These are more complex data concerning on the observed, expected and risk-adjusted mortality rate, which is an indicator used throughout the world by the healthcare sector in the case of heart diseases and in other cases for other illnesses and important diseases. These data are interesting and can provide an objective evaluation of the quality of the care provided. At the same time, they also give an indication about the quality of care. Those that are the quality assessments. At the university, we have students assessing the quality of the professors, and so these assessments have to be taken in consideration. Of course, there may be students giving a more strict assessment for specific reasons. So that's not an objective assessment, but it's based on the perception of the user. What is happening and what happened in this specific set of data concerns a new phenomenon we discussed yesterday and this morning, i.e. the sharing society. We spoke about the sharing economy. I would like now to introduce the sharing society and the outsourcing or the crowdsourcing approach, where users are no longer passive but become proactive, because users provide data and information, and they take part in the construction of the datum itself. And now I have to mention another project we developed. The current research on qualitative measurement of social value, a situated approach, is the title of this research, because it is focusing on three scenarios: the problem of stroke, the problem of back pain, and the problem of a high fever in a child. For each of these scenarios, we have collected a certain number of useful data, and then we have highlighted or pinpointed 4 dimensions according to which these data may be taken into consideration: urgency, connection, criticality, likelihood. Just a few notes. I cannot enter into greater details here now, but please get in touch with me if you want to share a discussion on this approach. Then we have overlapped these 3 dimensions, according to which the data for these 3 scenarios can be analyzed. We then circulated the forms, and then I would like to mention some results. So we really tried to carry out an empirical research on the problem of the social value, which started to be studied in the open data just a few years ago. We are in the infancy of this kind of research for open data. Now, we have to wonder, we have to say, is everything fine? Are we just faced with best practices and Uganda examples? That is not the case. In the literature, we have a large number of experiences which have given the results opposite to the one required by the project, or for the reasons for which the project was launched. Because, first of all, because those who choose the open data and choose and collect the open data, which have to be transformed in order to be published, so those collecting open data are technologists, unfortunately, and they are not the right people to collect the data. 3 years ago, Obama launched a great project in 2013 with an executive order signed by Obama, where he said that all administrations at all levels in the USA had to publish at least 3 data sets as open data. The literature is telling us that the choices were chance choices or administrative choices without ever evaluating the interest that this data may have had for the public. Of course, we have to choose the data, to assess the data, not just in the inside, but also in the outer context. In the case of Brisometer, we have seen that the value of data is given by the fact that the data are correlated and pulled together. And this requires certain skills and abilities. Summing up, we can say that technology must not be seen as an end in itself, but rather as a means. Therefore, the criteria to be adopted in choosing the data and in processing them must be especially social criteria based on specific values. The second issue is that data and information are just a symbolic model of the reality. They have their own semantics, syntax or grammar. They are not just instrumental, they are not just stable. There is a meaning within those data, and the meaning has to be highlighted. Another example concerning India. India, in the 90s, the Karnataka state decided to digitalize all the cadastral land data in that territory, in that state. So, going back to the symbolic aspect, do think to the small owners of land, who were not able to read and write. And these small landowners were used to treating a symbolic kind of datum. On the left-hand side, you can see a symbolic kind of information which has its own syntax and grammar, and which had developed over the decades, whereas they were faced with different representations. But it was not just a problem of representation, but it was a problem also of administrative procedure. This small landowner didn't have any possibility of operating on this representation. Let me say that the aim, the target of the Karnataka state was to open up this information through transparency of information and accountability. The public administration had to be accountable, had to be responsible, had to be accountable for the decisions made, and claims had to be admitted, had to be accepted. The result was exactly the opposite of what it was required. For different reasons, I would like to mention two reasons. First of all, the digital divide was at stake here. The small landowners, the small farmers, who up to now had the ownership of the information treated for the land they owned through a symbolic representation they knew, now at that point they had to have a go-between. A front office operator was required, but in some cases the front office operator was able to provide an answer, in other cases he was not. And the front office operator could say, well, that's what the computer says, what can I do? Through that go-between, the fact was that corruption was enhanced, not diminished, because there were new points of intermediation where the process, the ownership of knowledge had been taken away from the farmer, and in the whole process of intermediation of negotiations, those who were aware of the procedures, those who had the knowledge about the procedures, the large landowners, had the key. Indeed, different parts of the land were sold by the small landowners to the large landowners, because the large landowners had more knowledge about the new procedures and the new process. What can be done when faced with these problems? Well, I already said what can be done. First of all, we have to be convinced that the use of digital technologies must not lead us to a passive role and acquisition. We know that many young people stay or are on the internet for many hours. They have to be proactive, not passive, though. They have to be able to interpret, to understand what are the sources, to understand what has changed or what's new in the processes, in the app which are made available by these new information and data. Yet another example from India, where an app was developed to contrast gender-based crimes. Crimes on women mainly. Here you can see a representation of the intensity of the different kind of gender-based crimes. And this representation is also available for the single cities. Here you have the representation for the geolocalized representation of the crimes committed in Hyderabad. Since I have some time still, let me mention or hint to another problem concerning my research activity, quality of data and information. There is a report showing that this georeferentiation or geolocalization was developed by some policemen, and the policemen, are human beings, so it's not clear what is the procedure they followed. There is the suspicion that there is an excessively high intensity of crimes committed in certain roles. The datum is a symbolic representation of reality. It's not reality in this case too. This Indian association said that it is necessary to go back and to understand from where the information comes, or the way in which these data are generated. This has to be transparent. Then in this app you have other possibility, share your story, join the campaign. These are applications which are propping up in other countries, for example Egypt, and this, as far as I'm concerned, this is an initial important indication. Then when you carry out a monitoring activity on open data sites, you have to use technological indications. One of the technological indications is the stars, giving the maturity level of the opening of the data. So the maximum level is that they are presented in a format which can be linked to other data, so the so-called linked data. But then you also need some social indicators. You have the take-up by citizens and the availability, accessibility of the form. If you concentrate on the number of visits and download of data, so this is a public indicator, first of all, because I can have access to data I'm interested in to assess the administration and the municipality. And then the fact that I'm downloading it is rather a social aspect. What can be done? The social value of data is an open research issue because it started with the open data, so just a few years ago. And then it's a problem of governance. It's a governance issue, and it's also a question of education and training. The previous educator has really paved the way for me, because he said that in the United States there are many courses on data science. Next year we're going to open a course on data sciences for all the different sectors of the universities, because it's an interdisciplinary aspect, really. Then it is important to take the initiatives, but we have to see what is the readiness of the users and the actors. Do remember the example of the Indian small landowners, and we have to pay attention to the data which are exchanged and to the production, dissemination process and the way in which these data are taken up by the new administrative procedures. And last but not least, we have to become proactive, from a passive role to an active role for citizens. The digital data should convince us that we have to pay a greater attention to the information we are given. We have to be more critical. And then we go back to veracity, which was mentioned this morning. If we pay more attention, we are more involved and more empowered as citizens, as political subjects living in a society. This is my email address, and thank you very much for your attention.